As leaders, we are so often focused on serving others that we neglect our own self-care, our own soul care. We neglect the fact that our greatest stewardship responsibility is ourselves. I'm Tim Foote, CEO of Slingshot Group. Welcome to the podcast. And today, I'm joined by Mindy Caliguire, who is co-founder and president of Soul Care. And this is going to be a rich conversation. Mindy, at time of recording, sadly, there are crazy, unprecedented fires burning in California. And I bring that up because it was actually a wildfire that really shaped a lot of your work on your recent book. Talk a bit about that story.
Yeah. So it was just over 3 years ago now that here in Boulder, Colorado, which is where we are close to right now, similar conditions to what's going on in California, only that is now far eclipsed the damage that we saw. But some wild winds crept in at 10:30, 11 o'clock in the morning, and they escalated to 70 miles per hour, 100 miles per hour, 110 miles per hour. And somewhere in that, all it took was a spark. And the wildfires were horrific. They burned through neighborhoods, through suburbs. Colorado in the past has had plenty of wildfires up in the mountains usually. And it's actually part of the ecosystem and it's inconvenient, but Colorado was used to that. They had never had it impact suburbs the way it happened those 3 years ago. And so it impacted our family in two different ways. Our home at the time was in a town nearby here called Louisville, and that was our home. And then we also have some property in South Boulder that is on Marshall Road. So you remember they were called the Marshall Fires. So the fire started just down the hill from the property. And destruction for us there and in the neighborhoods in Louisville was a very severe disruption to that year. That whole year, I had just stepped away from my role at a great company that I love, and to this day, I'm still very connected to at Glue. And so everything was sort of heavily disrupted that year. And as you mentioned, first 6 months, I was just trying to survive. Where's our house? Where's our stuff? Where are we living? What's going on? And then eventually people who saw that both in my personal life and on the land, the way I was caring for my soul was allowing me to be present in a significant way, even though everything around me was really hard. And then secondly, the metaphor of how the wildfires had burned through the land and the damage to the trees and many different things started becoming something I just sensed God speaking to me in, because our whole world was talking about burnout, especially people in ministry and leadership. And that's where it can be most insidious and aching, is where those who are, as you said, they're giving themselves, they are sacrificially serving. They'll never leave their posts. They'll never leave the faith, but they can't seem to find a way of life that is sustaining them in the midst of their service. And so I don't have a ton of judgment around that. The book also talks about my own very severe burnout many, many years ago. And so the fires here in Boulder allowed us to essentially weave together the story of what had happened with the fires and what had happened with my burnout so many years ago, to try to bring people into the imagination that maybe it doesn't have to be this way, that burnout is real. Let's be willing to face what's hard and what's not working, what's real. But let's also recognize that it can actually not get the best of us, but instead light a path to flourishing. So that's how the book relates to the fires, and it is hard to watch what's going on in California right now.
It's a powerful metaphor, Mindy. A lot of the time we talk at Slingshot about team health and how we get so focused on who we're serving that we forget who we're serving with. But one step deeper is forgetting serving yourself.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about self-care. You take it a step deeper and talk about soul care. Talk about the difference.
Yeah, I do think they're related, and it's not like like one is right or wrong, but here's how I would distinguish them. And in truth, if we want to get, biblical on these things, the deepest understanding of what your soul is yourself, right? Your whole person. In Matthew 16, where Jesus says, how can you benefit if you gain the whole world but forfeit your soul? We think of that as like an evangelistic appeal and a thing you would throw down as a really important question for someone who's far from God. And that could be fine, but leaders need to know that that's the question Jesus was asking his disciples. It's quite clear in the passage. And he's asking that question to the people who've dropped their nets and left their home and have spent years following him. And that should give us pause, that this isn't just a question that only relates to someone who is considering a relationship with God. This is a question that he's asking his followers then and now and us. And the second thing that comes to us from that passage that I think is important, that gets to this self versus soul care, is that the same word for soul, translated in verse 26 as soul, is the Greek word for psyche. Greek word psyche, P-S-U-C-H-E, like we would say psyche or psychology. In verse 25, the same exact word is used, same Greek word, but it's translated life. And the biblical concept of your soul is inextricably woven together with what is your life. Everything that makes you, your personhood, your thoughts, your mind, your emotions, your physical body, your relationships, renovation of the heart. Dallas Willard talks about a lot of these things. So now let me get to your question. So self-care versus soul care. Self-care in our popular culture right now generally refers to I'm getting enough sleep, I'm getting good nutrition, I have exercise and movement, I maybe get a bubble bath in, or I go to the spa for a treatment. And I'm a fan of all those things. They are all very good, and they can be really important. When I'm thinking about what I mean by soul care, I'm really talking about the practices, the rhythms, the relationships that help my soul stay open in real time to the living God. What are the practices? What are the rhythms? What are the relationships? What am I doing intentionally to keep my soul alive to God in real time? Everybody in ministry believes many good things about God. They know great theology. They are very strong of will in a good way, of their commitment, their fierce commitment to God's purposes. But sometimes what can happen is our lived experience of God's nearness. God hasn't gone anywhere, but our experience of that nearness, our awareness, our receptivity to what he's doing in and around us is what can waver. And so those practices, those rhythms, those relationships are what help us stay alive to God, alive to God's presence with us, alive and responsive to what he's doing in us and around us. And so to me, it's entirely possible to do a lot of what's currently in the category of self-care and never let your soul actually be connected and open to God.
Wow.
So I love self-care, how we're defining it, but I want to make sure leaders are thinking about how are they intentional about caring for their soul. We don't actually care for our own soul. We put ourselves in the care of the one who cares for our soul. But that requires some intentionality and effort. And even as Jesus did in his example of his life, he wasn't go, go, go all the time. He wasn't.
Mindy, that's profound. And as you're talking, I've got this picture of a faucet or a spigot in my mind.
Yeah.
And how do we keep that turned on to receive what God has for us?
Yes.
Because we can be practicing self-care, but that faucet can be turned off. You talked about practices in your book, Ignite the Soul, 6 practices.
Yeah.
Talk about what those practices are.
Yeah. They really come out of my own story, and I love sharing them.
Just quickly, Ignite Your Soul was number what book? There's been a few on.
Yeah, maybe 6.
Okay.
I don't know.
But this is just the latest one.
It
So
is the latest one.
You need to catch up on some Mindy Caliguire books. Yeah.
I hadn't written a book in over 11 years, and I didn't. I had a full-time job at a hair on fire tech company. Just all kinds of things that it didn't really fit into my life. And it wasn't until those fires that I became convinced that maybe the time would be right to introduce some of the journey to the world as best I could. So anyway, the practices, let me say, now you're gonna put me on the spot to remember them in sequence. Okay, I think the first one we talk about is the practice of paying attention. And if leaders are they're really flatlining and tired and burnout, then this is really where I would recommend starting. We can get to the point where we're just functioning out of what we know to do. Yeah. And sometimes in crises, that's a gift. But in general, we want to be building a ministry life that is working very much with God, not just going off on our own understanding, so to speak. Yeah. So learning to pay attention is actually a lot of what the whole spiritual life is about. And attending to God, attending to our own interior world, attending to the world around us. So there's like 3 sub-practices that we introduce in this broader rhythm and practice of paying attention. We call it the page, the person, and the plan. And this actually came because I was talking to leaders and they're like, okay, what's the one thing I need to do to take care of my soul? And I, would do an interior eye roll. I'm confessing to you. Like, why do I always have to reduce things to a one thing? And God really confronted me as I was in my heart listening to a leader say that to me. And he's like, you got to help people get some frameworks that can stay in their head really in a concise way. And I was like, I don't have a thing. Do you have a thing? And God's like, yeah, just tell me needs a page, a person, and a plan. I was like, you do alliteration? Like, that's not...
I like alliteration.
Do you? Well, yeah. So does God, I think. So in any case, the page is the invitation to reflection. And that's really journaling. A lot of soul care started back many, many decades ago with how can we invite people into the authentic Christian spiritual life through the pages of a journal? How can we invite them into the deeper journey of what's really going on inside and how are they actually doing? A place to pray, to process. There's all kinds of even great neuroscience around how physically writing harnesses different parts of your brain and slows you down to the pace that you can write at. There's just a lot of good benefits, humanly speaking. But then spiritually, there's a lot of benefit as well. And I love to say that for leaders, some people love journaling, some people love to hate journaling, and I'm not here to twist anybody's arm necessarily. It's a little invitation, but there's some great research on how our capacity for influence can be actually capped at our power for self or capacity for self-reflection. And that's like a big idea. Yeah. And if you want to only have access to influencing by virtue of your position or your authority or whatever, that's a certain kind of influence. But if you can move beyond that into your own capacity for reflection, it actually broadens. It's a giving away of a power a little bit because it takes some sacrifice to look inside. But when we do, it actually increases our capacity for leadership.
That thin space of self-reflection. So attention's the first one.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that's the first one.
That's right.
Page, the person's the invitation to connection, and the plan is invitation to intention. The next one, this is probably one of my favorites. And again, this is significant for those. The book was not written as a leadership book, but most of my work is with leaders, so a lot of it sort of easily translates to that environment. Participation is what we're invited to do with the Spirit of the living God to do what God is doing in the world. And when we are alive to God, when we're paying attention, when we're able and responsive to promptings, wisdom, receiving the energies of God into the different things that we're committed to, we can kind of become the hinge points between what God wants done and what happens on earth as it might be in heaven. And so I was just at a church this past weekend, and we spent a lot of time talking about this with their staff and with the congregation, because some people think the invitation to soul care is only about silence and solitude and quietness, and I love that stuff. But it's that so that we can be alive to God, so that we can be participants in what God is doing in our world. But the reason so many of us end up burn out, you talked about that spigot, or think of an electrical connection, whatever is the source of our power. When we lose connection with the source of our power, we lose our capacity to serve and to create and to imagine and to lead.
It's simple but profound.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So attention, participation, talk about delight.
Delight is also a very fun one. And especially if you're in a season of burnout, it can feel like I don't even remember what gives me joy anymore. Yeah. But there is a certain way that you and anyone listening, their soul comes alive.
Yeah.
Just with sheer fun things. Like it could be textures or colors or food they love to eat or prepare or an athletic activity they love or whatever it is. We can get so focused on our being productive that we miss doing things intentionally that are just, they give us delight. And something sort of light and spontaneous and delight-filled is important for your soul health. And I think there's something really unique to the way God has made each and every one of us. That is like, I don't know, what for you? What's the thing that gives you delight? Is it?
Gosh, I love outdoors. I love running. I'm a runner.
Okay, you're a runner.
I love music. I'm a foodie.
Yes.
I love a nice restaurant.
See?
I got a number of things that give me delight.
I love it. And how sorry would it be if you got so busy you couldn't do any of those things?
Yeah.
That is just, it's a means by which the Lord of the universe helps infuse life into your soul. And I think it's important for each of us to know what those things are and to intentionally build space for that in our lives.
I bet, Mindy, you run into leaders that are so far down the spectrum of burnout that they forget what even delights them. You know, they can't even name those things.
I tell that story in the book, I'm pretty sure. I was in Australia in, Melbourne, I think, and at a church there doing a day-long thing where the topic of what gives you joy, which is basically related to this, came up. And I was doing some interactive pieces after a main session. And it was a women's event, and there were maybe 600 women were there that day. And I did a very similar thing like this. I just said, we just had this session, write down on your page, what are 6 things that give you joy? What are 6 things that give you delight? And turn to your person next to you and share what it was. There was an audible gasp in the room. And at lunch, we had a session, a break for lunch after that, because I'd done this in 3 other cities and 1 other country, many cities there. And everybody just normally just like gets writing and they start talking. And I asked at lunch, what's going on? And there were some circumstances in that entire community that had been quite oppressive to many of the women leaders. And that's what my host had attributed that reaction to. And I think that's true. I know when my husband asked me when I was so burnt out, like, what would you do for fun? And I was like, we don't have time. We don't have money. We don't have, I can't go do something for fun. And thankfully he pushed me to get to do something. And to this day, I do write about in the chapter. It's like, I do not remember doing the thing, which I wish I did. That would probably be a lovely story. I was so uncomfortable. I probably couldn't even let it in. But I remember the deep discomfort I had sitting in the parking lot, getting ready to go in to do the thing, because I hadn't done anything for fun in so long. Didn't that sound terrible? And I thought I was serving so nobly.
Well, Minnie, I'm sure there are people listening right now that are going, oh, I can't even think of a thing. Talk about humility.
Yeah. Sometimes we think of humility only as a result of our character growth. But if you look at a lot of the imperatives in Scripture, it sure seems like it's a choice. And there are times we should practice humility. We should take the lesser seat at the table rather than putting ourselves to the front. We should humble ourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he would lift us up. The lifting up is not in our hands. It's in God's hands. And so I think this is one of the important things in our day, especially in this work of ministry and leadership, because we sadly live in a context currently where the things that kind of get elevated as the success markers become the things everyone's paying attention to. And it can easily happen that we think chasing after those things, attendance, the Instagram followings, these kinds of things are in fact the most important things. And They're just not.
Mm.
And humility is the safest place for leaders' hearts to be, and the most fertile soil for God to do what God might do. So I think it's really important that we become intentional about that, and begin to notice in ourselves. Like, this is why paying attention is the root of all of the good things, because you have to learn to start to notice when pride starts to lift its ugly head, which it does in me, in all of us. Like, let's stop being surprised in any way. That's gonna happen. But like, let's start to develop our capacity to notice it.
Yeah.
And then start to think, what does it mean to refuse this? What does it mean to even just silently, when we hear our own thoughts being grandiose or whatever it might be, competitive, or because pride, the lack of humility shows up in a lot of different ways. How do we begin to saying, God, that is not my deepest desire. That thought just came in my mind. That is not my deepest desire. Help me. Help me be different.
Well, it's the voices you listen to, isn't it, Mindy? And, you talk about how attention undergirds it all. Who was it that said humility isn't thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less?
Yeah.
It's listening to what God wants, sometimes more than what you want.
Yes.
Talk about the final two practices, silence and rest.
Yeah, silence is a game changer. And many of us in our evangelical-ish context, that was never introduced to me. And it was through a mentor during my really severe season of burnout that something called silent prayer was introduced. And let me give you the definition of it, because it is so beautiful. Sometimes even saying the definition just causes my spirit to rest differently. So as it was introduced to me, silent prayer is a wordless way of resting in the presence of God with an attitude of openness, contrition, and longing. Isn't that just a beautiful definition? Silent prayer is a wordless way of resting in the presence of God with an attitude of openness, contrition, and longing. And the sort of biblical or scriptural imagination for that comes to us from Psalm 131, where the psalmist, and I believe it's David, writes in one of the Psalms of Ascents that I have stilled, like I have stilled and quieted my soul like a weaned child on its parent's lap is my soul within me. And it's this beautiful picture of being close for the sake of relationship. Now, I think God welcomes our prayer. We know He welcomes, He invites our prayers, our requests, our ideas, our lament. There's many different ways that we use our words in prayer. But this way of resting in God's presence and letting go of our words, and leaders, we need to learn how to let go of our words.
Yes, we do.
It's just true. It's just true. And you don't really realize how sort of addicted you are to your own noise.
Well, Psalm 31 there, Mindy, like a weaned child on its parent's lap, that the first half of that is it is a weaning. You've got to separate yourself from the words.
That's a really good point. Yes. Yes.
And that's a process.
Yeah. And because words are one of the ways we bring control, right? Control in a good way, but that's how you cast vision. That's how you recruit volunteers. That's how you raise money. It's all about our words, and learning to let go of our words and just rest in a very Trinitarian way, like in the presence of God. Yeah. So this form of prayer has been a staple in my nearly daily life for now almost 30 years. And I can just attest to the transformational power that meeting with God and inviting God to move at a level below words, it's a game changer. So yeah, I wish every leader would embrace that.
These 6 practices, Mindy, are just transformative. And I'm sure you've seen that over and over again. And I'm sure leaders watching or listening right now are doing a personal inventory. Talk a little bit about how the soul care of a leader affects their team.
Oh, my goodness. Well, first of all, it can't not. So your soul, whether you like it or not, whether you know it or not, your soul is driving everything that matters to you. That's a big statement, and it's true. So however you think you're leading your team, your soul's health or lack thereof is absolutely impacting that. It is in fact not just impacting it, it is out of that soul is what is that leadership is coming from. So it is not a choice of whether your soul care will impact your team. It is what kind of impact do you want to be having on your team because of your either healthy soul or unhealthy soul. Now, when we talk about the impact on teams of an unhealthy soul on a leader, first of all, their capacity to pay attention is low. So they're not really noticing what's going on of their team members. They even may not have much awareness that also every single team member's performance is a result of their own soul health. So we have a kind of a inadequate way of looking at people's performance if we only see them as sort of machine parts that are performing or not performing instead of as living souls in a context. So first of all, you can't not have your soul's health impact your team. Your ability to pay attention or not will impact the whole of your team. How much can you even see what might be coming? How much can you even notice? Where is God at work in here, and how are we responding to that? Those are all accessible to you from a place of soul health. But some of the symptoms that leaders talk about, like we have a lot of assessments for the health of the soul, a lot of the symptoms of soul neglect, it's a benign neglect. Nobody sets out to trash the well-being of their soul, but it happens. And some of the symptoms really show up in how you lead. So the level of anger that you carry that can be a very effective way of leading people. We have plenty of examples of that. The level of fear that you are carrying, which you might think you're protecting your team from, but how does God hold you in those places where you're feeling anger or you're feeling fear? And how does that have a way to metabolize, connect with God so that it doesn't become you? Like Dallas Willard has a great quote that our emotions, like anger or fear, can be terrific servants, but terrible masters.
Wow.
So again, back to journaling or awareness. I need to know if I'm leading my team, but I'm showing up with my own, like I'm not just, I don't only have the capacity to feel fear, I'm becoming a fearful person. Fear is how I'm making my decisions. It's how I'm trying to rally people's support. It's out of fear and scarcity that I'm trying to get somebody to do a thing. Like that's what we call toxic leadership.
Yeah.
Right. So your soul's well-being, you can read all the books in the world about how not to lead that way. But if your soul is not well, it can't, you will not have the ability to get beyond to lead from a different place.
Yeah. Mindy, that's why this conversation is so important, because so goes the soul care of the leader, so goes the team.
Yes.
So there's a leader of a nonprofit or a church listening or watching today that is in a deficit, that didn't do well on the personal inventory of the 6 practices, but doesn't feel like they've got time to do anything different.
Right.
What's a small step they
Right.
could take today?
Right. Friends, right now, you can just breathe a little prayer and say, God, I need help. I need help. I need you to create space in my life. I need you to create willingness. I need a pathway, whatever it is you guys need. And I do think one of the biggest first steps is like pull out a journal. It doesn't have to take even 15 minutes. You might end up longer, but pull out a scrap of paper and admit to yourself, what is your life really like right now? And then if you can, what would you want it to be like? You may not be able to get there yet. You may be so sort of only aware of what's hard right now. Please know you're not alone in that. Like there are a lot of people who are really struggling. And I believe God is bringing a wave of healing into ministry leaders right now. I believe the floodgates are opening because the awareness is growing. And I think the hunger and thirst for a different way is growing. And I promise you, God is sufficient to meet you in that place of deficit. But you got to admit it first.
Yeah.
That is, you've got to say, this actually isn't working. My life actually doesn't really feel good.
Yeah. And then get online and order the book, Ignite Your Soul. But also tell us, Mindy, that the work that you're doing and how leaders and teams can get in touch with that.
Yeah. One of the indicators of how long I've been at this is the fact that I have soulcare.com.
Right.
People are like, how did that happen? It's a very fun story. But go to soulcare.com. That is where we're galvanizing a whole team of leaders, people who get it, who understand the challenges of leadership, to bring together resources, journeys, digital pathways, relational connections with spiritual directors and coaches, and then coming alongside organizations with assessment for their team, all kinds of stuff. We love speaking to this moment in the body of Christ.
Well, this isn't going to be the only conversation we're having. We need to have another one. But
Delighted.
as we wind down, Mindy, what is God teaching you in this season that is shaping your future leadership self?
My future leadership self is being very much shaped by the invitation to intercession. I was just talking to a team member about it this morning, and to a team that prays with us on a weekly basis about the work. We often talk in leadership terms about what our best and highest use is, best and highest good, and that kind of stuff. And I have wrestled with that, as many leaders do, and I've gotten feedback on me as a leader, or me as a communicator, or me as any other thing that I could show up in the world to do. But in prayer, just because it's right after the first of the year right now as we're talking, and I was just processing this with God, expecting maybe God would give me some new, what is my best and highest use? And the strongest sense I got was intercession, which feels about as non-leader. So this is current for me, check in with me in a few months and you may learn more about what I've learned. But I feel like there's an invitation to seeing intercession as a primary avenue of the work, which is a little new. I mean, there's famous people that have said prayer is the work, and I quote it, but it's never been my number one priority of how I'm thinking about leading this organization and my team. So
we need to talk to Jesus more.
Stay tuned. Listen. I do need to.
Listen. We all do. Mindy, you are a deep well, and I want to draw more water from this well at some point. But thank you.
Enjoy it, Tim.
Well, thank you for the work that you're doing with so many leaders and teams, and the difference that you're making, and just your willingness to have this conversation today.
Delighted.
Today, yeah. And I'm sure you have been taking that personal inventory of those 6 practices. There is so much here, so much depth here for you to work on as a leader, and to grow as a leader, and to care for your soul, because so goes the soul care of the leader, so goes the team. So if you think another leader needs to hear this, please share it, please follow, do all the things, and stay curious and reach for the remarkable.